This will be the video lecture for PSY 300 and my coverage of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. I want to start with a little background on the film and just kind of properly place it historically, both in the context of film, but also in the context of the novel, where the novel was positioned and historically and so on. So the Ken Kesey novel, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, was published originally in 1962. It remains in print. I can recall very clearly when I was in high school in the 1970s and 80s, it was required reading for students. It was one of those sort of canonical books for young people to read during that period of time. I don't believe that's still the case, but it was a very popular novel for making people think hard about the nature of institutionalization and what it could mean for people. Kirk Douglas, who was at the time a very up-and-coming young actor, bought the rights to the novel when it was still in galleys, meaning it hadn't been officially published yet. And this is something that happens in Hollywood. Publishing companies would send early prints of novels that they thought had a possibility of being made into films or television shows. And people who not typically actors, but people who want to do production, will sometimes purchase those rights for a relatively small amount and then pursue production. Kirk Douglas originally wanted to use the novel as the basis for a stage play. It was then produced for the stage, although not successfully so. The play was, the adaptation of the novel into a play was written by Dale Wasserman. Douglas attempted to send the novel to an up-and-coming Czechoslovakian filmmaker, Milos Forman, but Forman was at the time still based in Czechoslovakia. They had met briefly, and Douglas was interested in Forman picking up the project and making the film. So he after this casual interaction, agreed to send the novel to Forman. But Czechoslovakia at the time was a very locked down communist country. There were censors who checked the mail, particularly for artists and intellectuals, and they seized the novel, so we never saw it. Douglas and Forman both sort of mutually thought that each one was ignoring the other. So fast forward a decade, in 1971, Mike Douglas, Milos Forman was still making films. He had made a name for himself. There had been some changes in Czechoslovakia that made it more possible for Forman to travel and to be able to make productions in the United States. So Michael Douglas, who is Kirk Douglas's son, also a famous actor in his own right, in 1971, he sent the book to Forman. This time, Forman received it. They agreed they wanted to make a film. They felt it had great potential. But no studio, none of the major studios. It was 1971. The United States, we were coming toward the end of the Vietnam War. There was a tremendous upheaval and unrest that kind of was moving major film production companies in the direction of saying, we want lighter fare. We want more joy, more happiness. We want to stay away from heavy topics. And certainly Cuckoo's Nest is not light. So they couldn't get any kind of traction with major production companies. Michael Douglas, though, was still very committed to the project. And he wanted to get it made. He was young. He didn't have a lot of money at his disposal, so he and Forman set about making Cuckoo's Nest as a low-budget film, shooting on location in Oregon. Douglas enlisted Bo Goldman, who wrote the screenplay. They started trying to cast actors, originally going to, very what we would call today A-list stars like Gene Hackman and Marlon Brando at the time, who passed on the role. Both Hackman and Brando had played parts like McMurphy in the past and were not interested. They were also, they were A-list stars. They were more bankable than that, and they didn't necessarily see a future in the project. The part of the big nurse, Nurse Ratched, was offered to people, again, at the time, 1971. These were A-list stars. Was offered to Anne Bancroft and Angela Lansbury. And for Lansbury in particular, she had just played a part of a ruthless female lead and didn't want to be typecast in that kind of role. Louise Fletcher lobbied for the role. She was young. In the parts she had been playing at the time, she looked even younger than she did in the film, where she was made to look more like a person in her 40s. She was not at the time. She was quite young, so was Jack Nicholson. She had to lobby. She had to convince Milos Forman and Bo Goldman that she had the chops for the role. And her kind of route into being able to convince them was to say that she saw Nurse Ratched through a particular lens, through someone, whether it was a deluded notion or not, as someone who truly believed she was doing the best by the people in her care. And that's what convinced them that she was the right person for the role. Jack Nicholson eventually took the role of McMurphy. He was an up-and-coming actor, not yet A-list by any stretch, but he had played some very well-reviewed roles recently that were getting him noticed as a tough guy, who had the capacity for good stage acting. The remaining actors, originally Milos Forman, and your textbook author talks about this, had wanted to use actors from the psychiatric institution where they were filming, the Oregon State Hospital, because there were still actual patients living in residence on the ward. You can see some of these patients in some of the shots where there are background people. We would call them extras. Many of those extras are actual patients and staff of the hospital from that time period. As your textbook author notes, Foreman didn't find the people living at the institution to be visually as interesting as he wanted them to be. And we'll talk about that more as we move through the presentation here today. The ensemble cast, they were mostly young stage actors and or stand-up comedians. And the reason Milos Forman selected them, in addition to their physical features, was the fact that comedians and stage actors are much more adept at improvisation. And Milos Forman demanded that kind of skill set in his actors. Some of the actors, and you discovered this in your reading for this module, some of the actors lived on the ward for a period of time in order to create their characters and make choices about how they were going to physically move about the ward, how they were going to speak, and so on. Now, this was not the case for Nicholson. Nicholson arrived on the first day of shooting without having any sort of experience with the hospital, and Forman did that intentionally. He wanted Nicholson, the actor, to arrive as the character, McMurphy, did, to a hospital that was a foreign environment, meeting people that he did not know. The people playing the parts of staff, including Nurse Ratched, Louise Fletcher, during that period of prep time, they would come to work, familiarizing themselves with the routine, with the space, so that they would appear to be very comfortable in that space and the routine that it was based on. But they would go back to their hotels every night. The actors playing residents of the hospital, they slept there. They stayed there 24/7 during filming. The group therapy scenes, and I'll talk about this more as we move through the presentation. Milos Forman, as a filmmaker, was innovative. He had an attraction to improvisation. While there was a very clear script, he was not opposed to his actors moving in other kinds of directions. And as I said before, he chose actors who were adept and capable of that. The group therapy scenes were innovative from a filmmaking standpoint in that Forman was one of the very first filmmakers to use multiple cameras simultaneously. Having them run at the same time meant that he could get the natural reactions of actors who were sitting across from one another, interacting with one another. He could capture their reactions on film simultaneously without having to reset, rerun the scene, and capture those reactions independently. His mantra, as actors who've worked with him have said repeatedly, his mantra was, "It must be real. It must be real." And that really was something that both, Nicholson, who doesn't interview much, but both Nicholson and Louise Fletcher enjoyed that aspect of working with him. Now, before we go digging into the film much further, we need to remind ourselves of those stereotypes, the classic stereotypes of people with mental illness as they're presented in film. The first of these is the theme of dangerousness, and that stereotype certainly becomes evident in the film fairly early on, but most intensely in the closing scenes. But you see McMurphy being presented as a fighter, as a bit of a thug, as certainly a career criminal, as a person who was imprisoned for violence against a girl. He was imprisoned for statutory rape. So he's presented to you as a violent man, and the persistent question is, is he or is he not mentally ill? But there's no question he's a violent, dangerous person. Some of the other characters within the ensemble cast are presented to you as dangerous and unpredictable as well. Many of the characters in the ensemble are presented as childlike. Certainly, Danny DeVito, and some of the other characters are presented to you as infantile, as not bright, as not capable of basic problem solving or basic card play, for example. Many are presented as immature, pretending to be quite sophisticated but unable to cope with simple things. So many of them are presented as childlike in their habits and in their behavior. Incompetency goes hand in hand with that, as I just mentioned, not being able to play cards or follow rules, not being able to solve disputes in a way that adult men should be able to solve disputes. Unpredictability is certainly built into the package. In the group therapy scenes, they routinely dissolve into shouting and screaming and arguments that are inane and very adolescent in their quality, really not productive in any sense, but it's in part the unpredictability of the men that makes them a bit unnerving. Blame and malingering comes in some sneakier forms in this particular film, but you can see it. When McMurphy becomes aware that most of the men on his ward are there voluntarily, a message that's being communicated to you is that these are people who have given up the independence and responsibility of living their lives and instead are taking the hospital way out. They're here, they're being taken care of, they walk around in pajamas most of the time. They're accepting this infantile life instead of being men and being responsible. Now, other aspects of blameworthiness are by extension. So with Billy Bibbit, it's the blame is really centered on his mother. For some of the men, you're not given specific information about blameworthiness, but you're certainly given hints of malingering, especially when the men start to become more energized, more willing to argue with Nurse Ratched. They are eloquent, they are clear, they state what their rights are, but she batters them back and they knuckle under. That's a sneaky way of saying these are people who willingly are putting themselves in the role of patient, and that's another form of malingering. The contagion idea is mostly communicated in this film through McMurphy. He goes through this transformation over the course of the story arc of the film, moving from darker colors in his clothing, more street clothing, to hospital scrubs, to even more tattered and dingy hospital scrubs by the end of the film, as he becomes wrapped into the place and eventually dies there. The idea of untreatability is communicated pretty directly, that whether it's Nurse Ratched talking about the quote-unquote chronics who are committed, or talking about the men who are voluntary, it appears that there are no solutions to their problems, and that in fact the staff may be behaving in ways that ensure their untreatability. Now we need to kind of draw our lens back and think about the institution film, and I want you to think about the films that you've seen across your life that are set in some kind of institution. So it can be a school, or a prison, or a military base, or an encampment of some kind. Those are institutions, and institution films tend to have some elements that they share. For psychiatric institution films, there are some key elements. We often see a gray building, a dank building that is like this one. Now, this film was shot on location in a still functioning psychiatric hospital in Oregon, the Oregon State Hospital, and Dr. Dean Brooks, who has a small role in the film, was the actual director of the Oregon State Hospital, which was in the process of being closed down. In the late 1960s, early 1970s, we were in a period of time in the history of psychiatry in America called deinstitutionalization. Large state-run mental hospitals were being shut down and emptied out systematically. And at the time of filming, I believe, I would have to fact check this to correct my memory, I believe at the time of filming there was only one functioning ward, and that is the people that you can kind of see among staff or in the background of scenes that are being shot. Those are some of the men who were still in residence. There are some pretty typical scenes that you will see in institution films set in a psychiatric facility. The group therapy scenes have become kind of ubiquitous in these films. Exercise time has become a staple, and it's usually inane exercise like stretching and some sort of kind of art therapy that is more theatrical, like pretending to be a tree or something like that. There's also exercise time that's outdoor, and that typically is presented in a way that reminds the viewer that these are incarcerated people, or tries to clearly communicate that these are incarcerated people. So in the case of this urban hospital, you have chain link fencing that is quite high. The actor here who plays Chief Bromden is quite tall. He is, I believe he was, again, you'll have to fact check me on this, Will Sampson is the name of the Native American actor. He wasn't an actor until he was cast in this film, but I believe he was 6'7" or 6'8". So it's a very tall fence, and it has barbed wire at the top. The clear message to the viewer is these are people that have to be forcibly kept inside. And if we don't keep them in, they're dangerous to you, because we don't fence in people like this unless they are dangerous to us. Another form of recreation time that is often shown in these psychiatric institution films involves card playing, other kinds of game play, watching television, smoking cigarettes. You'll notice that even if these films are not set in the 1960s and 70s, there will be smoking that's involved, and that's a topic for another day for us. But you'll see a lot of card playing, a lot of board game playing, a lot of television, and most of it, inane and not particularly productive. Medication time is also a really standard part of these psychiatric institution films. And there's routinely an element where the staff is shown demanding that people take medication that they don't know what it is. And when they ask what it is, they are treated as disobedient. They are not told what their medications are, but they're informed that they are required to take them. In many cases in these films, as is the case with Cuckoo's Nest, people are threatened. They're told that they will be forced to take their medication if they don't take it voluntarily. Their mouths are often checked to see if the pills are there or if they have been swallowed. But at the same time, there's a message sent at other points in the film, in these films, where characters are shown tonguing their meds, hiding their meds, trading their meds, and perhaps having sort of a little black market way of using their medications as a way to get other kinds of resources, such as cigarettes or sex. Many of these films also include an escape narrative. There's routinely a period in the film where the patients go on an adventure of some kind. Sometimes it's within the walls of the institution. We'll see that in our next film, in Girl Interrupted. Sometimes it's outside the walls of the institution, as is in the case of Cuckoo's Nest. And for this film, you have the fishing expedition, where McMurphy kind of hustles the whole crew onto a boat. They have just a very masculine recreation time with each other, where they're engaged in what, by 1970s standards was a very masculine pursuit, fishing, fishing big fish in the ocean, and for McMurphy's part, having very grown-up sex with his friend. Now we need to, I've not done my slide correctly here. We need to think about broad stereotypes that we have typically of psychiatric hospitals. And, first off, what we tend to see in psychiatric hospital institution films is that the staff is routinely presented to you as unqualified or burned out, otherwise incompetent. Sometimes they're presented as manipulative, as cold, and in some cases evil. And certainly with the big nurse, with Nurse Ratched, she's presented as uncaring and cold, except in her own mind. So she is definitely the evil that's present. If you look at Hollywood lists of the most famous villains in film, Nurse Ratched is within the top 10. because she is perceived by audiences very clearly in an unsympathetic light as the evil entity of the film. The other staff in this film are typically presented as just basically incompetent and routinely uncaring, and that includes the orderlies. Psychiatric institutions in films are routinely presented more like prisons than hospitals. You see that in the fencing, in the locks, in the restraints that are used during sleep time, in quiet rooms, and so on. Treatments are often presented as being ineffective and potentially harmful. Many films suggest to you that various forms of treatment are punitive. So in this film in particular, you're shown ECT as a response to misbehavior on the part of McMurphy or other patients. So they're given ECT after they've done very bad things in the eyes of the staff. So they're misbehaved. They've made demands, like demanding the cigarettes or demanding to watch baseball, and they've had a big blow up with Ratchet. What's the response? ECT. The final, the final blow up between McMurphy and Ratchet when he tries to kill her. The response to that is his permanent rendering into a more or less benign state through psychosurgery. Group therapy and medications are presented as ineffectual at best, and even the group therapy in this film is presented as causing more harm than good. We often see in these films the use of isolation and restraint. I've already mentioned restraint. Frequently there are images of straitjackets being used, 4-point restraints, and what that means is 4 points, meaning there's a restraint on each limb, on wrists and ankles, and then frequently there's a 5th added, a belt across the waist. And you see images of that in this film. There are also isolation rooms. You're given a brief glimpse of a double use of a quiet room. In this film, that's the place where Billy Bibbit and Mandy go to have sex, but it's also a place where people are punished, where people are locked up. We'll see more vividly how that works in our next film, Girl Interrupted. There's also the stereotype of contagion, that once you go into an institution, you don't get out unless someone lets you out or you escape. And that theme is very strong in this film. It's communicated by one of the staff members to McMurphy, who discovers a little too late that he can't leave until he's given permission by the staff, by the doctors, and by the nurses. Now, the way in which treatment is presented to you, and we need to go into this a little bit more in depth, you're given many images of treatment here, and I want to focus in on two of the modalities that we see with a little bit of a highlight of the issue of restraint. We'll start with restraint. From the opening scene, you're shown that these are people who need to be restrained. When the staff isn't around in high numbers, like when they're asleep, they need to be tied down so that they won't get into trouble, so that they won't wander, so that they won't get involved with each other. They should be restrained. That communicates dangerousness and unpredictability. It also creates the image that these are incompetent people who, if we don't tie them up for them to sleep, if we don't lock them down, they can't be trusted to behave like adults and stay in their own beds. Now, moving on to electroconvulsive therapy, and I will say that this recording software, it often doesn't pick up well sound from embedded video, so I will place this video on my playlist for PSY 300 so that you can watch it with better sound. But you get a clear message that ECT is something to be feared, something to be afraid of, worried about, You get that message very clearly as the men are waiting for their turn to undergo ECT. You're shown this iconic scene in Cuckoo's Nest. If you go to YouTube, type in ECT, still today in 2021, that scene from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest will come up. And when you ask people on surveys, what do you know about psychiatric treatment, they will still mention One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest as being formative in their attitudes towards psychiatric inpatient care. That it's something to be feared, it's a kind of punishment. Now the video clip that I want to show you is just, it's old now, but it's still pretty current with how electroconvulsive therapy is still used today. And yes, it is still used today. It is one of the most effective available treatments for chronic suicidal depression. Scientists don't know why it works, but it has an 80% success rate. It's not to be gone into without thinking about it. There are side effects, there are difficulties that people can suffer, including memory loss and other kinds of cognitive symptoms as a result of ECT. But there isn't a doctor who's going to just automatically turn their nose up at an 80% success rate when you're talking about people who are suicidally depressed. So here's some footage of how ECT is actually done.
At the beginning of ECT treatment, the patient is put to sleep. At 30 seconds later, is given a dose of muscle relaxant.
So that's how ECT is typically done. And students are often really surprised, number one, that ECT is still a thing that doctors prescribe and actually deliver. As I said, there are very few weapons in the psychiatric treatment toolbox for persistent treatment non-responsive suicidal depression. You're talking about people who are in danger of suicide imminently, and being able to interrupt that is extraordinarily important. Unfortunately, ECT is typically presented in institution films, number one, as a punishment, and number two, as a treatment for everything. Right now, the standards are that ECT is looked at as a treatment specifically for depression, both depression on its own and the depression that is associated with bipolar disorder or other mood disorders. Occasionally it's used for people with schizophrenia who have a co-diagnosis of suicidal depression. So it's a very restricted bandwidth of uses of that treatment. Now, the other treatment that's shown in the film inaccurately, that has elements of historical accurately, but certainly not by 1960s and 1970s standards, is psychosurgery, specifically the prefrontal lobotomy. By the end of the film, you're shown McMurphy. He's walked back in. He's in a he's ambulatory, but he's clearly not the person he was. Chief Bromden discovers that he has these healed incisions on the sides of both sides of his forehead. That was done to communicate to the audience mostly. Most psychosurgeries are not done, even at the time when prefrontal lobotomies were done, they were not done by incision and entry into the skull, say by cutting the skull and then entering the brain directly. If you're interested in the history of the lobotomy, you should watch the documentary The Lobotomist, or read the book on which the documentary is based, looking at Dr. Walter Freeman, who popularized briefly the use of that technique in the United States. Lobotomies are frequently deployed in institution films set in psychiatric hospitals, as a way of saying, this is the ultimate. If you are the worst patient, if you are the most dangerous patient, your brain we will modify your brain so that you are permanently rendered harmless. So I can't remember the exact wording, but one of the other patients says something like, he's as meek as a lamb. And that's the message that's being sent. If you are so violent that no treatment will work, nothing works, we will cut your brain up and we will render you either dead or essentially harmless, brainless, in a way. Now, real prefrontal lobotomies, not that they were ever ethical or appropriate or useful, were done with an ice pick type device that was pushed in through the eye socket. And I know for those of you who have a queasy stomach, just the thought of that is really horrifying, and it should be. Again, I'm not going to spend time in this class going over the history of the lobotomy. If you're interested in it, watch The Lobotomist or read the book, The Lobotomist. It will give you all of the very sad, unfortunate information you need to know. I'm going to pause here, and that will end part 1 of our coverage of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.